So it is my pleasure to introduce our second speaker in the Fall 2021 Language and Brain Seminar Series, Dr. Alexa Tompary. Alexa completed her PhD at NYU with Lila Dvachi, where her work used fMRI and behavioral methods in human subjects to inform theories of memory consolidation. In 2019 or thereabouts, Alexa hopped on the Jersey Turnpike to head down to the University of Pennsylvania to work as an NRSA postdoctoral fellow with Sharon Thompson-Schill, having earned an F32 award from the National Institute for the Neurological Disorders and Stroke. There, her work shifted to focus on how semantic knowledge causes distortions in episodic memory. Although journal identity is not a synonym for research quality, the impact of Alexa's work in the field of cognitive neuroscience can easily be seen by the venues she's already published in, including eLife, Neuron, the Journal of Neuroscience, the Journal of Experimental Psychology General, and Hippocampus, among others, and many of those multiple times. And the next phase of Alexa's career is bound to be equally exciting, as she's earned a prestigious K99R00 award from the National Institute of Mental Health. Congratulations, Alexa.
Thank you.
Aside from her groundbreaking empirical work, I'd be remiss not to mention Alexa's deep and demonstrated commitment to open science. She hosts data and code from nearly all of her studies on the Open Science Framework, where I've had some fun and will continue to have fun playing with them. So today, Alexa will tell us about her recent work on the distinction and interplay between semantic and episodic memory. In addition to being a critical topic for theories of memory, concepts, reasoning, and more, these areas of psychology are also crucial in establishing the kinds of representations that language can and can't draw from to help us communicate about the world we experience. I'm looking forward to hearing much more. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alexa Tompary to the Language and Brain Seminar.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Thank you guys for having me too. Let's get this set up. Let's see here. Okay, you can see my title screen. Okay, great. Okay, I think we mentioned this earlier, but if anything is unclear, definitely feel free to interrupt me. I'm happy to take clarifying questions in the middle. Today, I'm going to show you a series of behavioral experiments and some TMS data showing how we integrate episodic and semantic memory to scaffold new learning. So I moved to Philadelphia about 3 years ago now for my postdoc. One of the first coffee shops I ever visited when I moved, Steve, maybe you'll have been there. It's called Good Karma. It's become one of my favorites. It has this really beautiful back patio. It has very reasonable prices. It's a nice place to work too. So these are examples of generalized or aggregated knowledge I have about this coffee shop. So how did I learn these things? There are a few possibilities. First, I have several specific memories of being there. I remember the first time I went in, I was really exhausted from looking for apartments, and I was attracted by all these houseplants they had in the window. I also remember a time they had lavender lattes on the menu, and I was really interested in trying one. And I also remember a morning I was there and I developed this cool idea for a grant. So you could argue that by extracting and aggregating all of the common parts of these experiences over time, I've built up what I know about good karma. At the same time, before I even stepped in, I already knew a lot about coffee shops in general. I know what coffee is, I know what would be on the menu, I know approximately how much it would cost. So I have a lot of prior knowledge about coffee shops that could help me navigate this new one. So these are at least two forms of memory that I could draw on as I learn about a new, any sort of new phenomenon, right? Either specific episodes or more general aggregated prior knowledge. So what I'm interested in, what I'm going to talk about today, is how these forms of memory interact and draw on each other in the context of new learning. So when we're forming new general knowledge. I also wanted to start by sort of defining some terms for today's talk, just so we're all on the same page. So my memory of the lavender latte, for example, is considered an episodic memory. These are memories for a single event. They're linked to a specific time and place. They often contain multiple elements like people or places or objects. And we think that the association of these elements and their storage as a unified memory trace is supported by the hippocampus. On the other hand, aggregated or general knowledge can be thought of as information that, at one point was in a given episode or set of episodes, but is no longer linked to them. For the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to split this into two types. First, semantic memory. So some of my knowledge about good karma can be considered semantic, so supported by the anterior temporal lobe and kind of characterized in terms of like features or taxonomy. So today, semantic memory will be pretty much synonymous with category membership, like categories like animals and objects. Then other knowledge about this coffee shop can be considered more schematic, another kind of aggregated knowledge that's more commonly studied in terms of event structure, like the order of operations at a coffee shop. You usually order first, then you pay, then you have the coffee. Schemas are often considered to be statistical or spatial regularities in the literature too, and you'll see a lot of that in my talk today. And a lot of times the medial prefrontal cortex is implicated in this form of memory. And to be honest, I'm like a little skeptical that these are even fundamentally separate forms of aggregated knowledge. That could be, I think, fodder for an entire separate talk. But for the purposes of just today, I think it's helpful to define these in terms of these historically studied properties. And now that I've sort of set up these distinctions, what I'm actually going to do today is talk about how I don't think there truly is a purely episodic or purely aggregated form of memory. In fact, I think what we mostly do is draw on some mixture or combination of the two. And this isn't really a new idea. It's inspired by prototype and like exemplar theories of categorization and other literatures. But I'm really interested in how episodes and aggregated knowledge can combine or interact in the context of new learning. So I have mostly been thinking about this in a Bayesian framework. The idea is that memory can be characterized as a reconstruction or recombination of different sources of information. I'm going to use an experiment from a different group to illustrate this. So in this experiment, participants encoded shapes that were associated with different colors. And at retrieval, they were asked to identify the color of each shape on a continuous scale. So memory for a single object is considered to be really noisy. So you can characterize memory for the color of this hexagon as falling along a distribution of likely colors. However, in this experiment, participants relied on an additional source of information to make these judgments. They had basic prior knowledge of canonical colors, like what the color green looks like. So when the color of a studied shape was close to a canonical color, like green here, retrieval was more accurate. So this dotted distribution represents the new probability of retrieval based on the combination or the integration of memory for that specific hexagon and just general knowledge of the color green. And this little red bar here indicates a small error in color memory. So this suggests that prior knowledge can fill in the missing gaps of memory for specific events, and this would result in more precise memories. However, in that same study, participants also studied shapes with less standard colors, like this yellow-green triangle. And these colors were more likely to be retrieved as closer to a canonical green, again, by the same integration mechanism, right? Drawing on these two sources of knowledge. Because the encoded green color is far from a canonical green, integrating these two gives you a biased answer. So this really means that integrating episodic memories and prior knowledge can either help or harm you, depending on how much they're aligned. So this study and many others provide good evidence that memory isn't veridical, but instead is a result of integration across these different sources of information. And I'm applying this framework to new learning. So instead of thinking about retrieval of single and one-off memories, how do these two forms of information interact in a situation where we're learning and aggregating something new? So before we get into the design, I'm going to give you one last example of how this is going to work. It's going to closely match both of the parts of the talk that I'm going to give you today, the designs there. So the XY plane here now represents spatial locations. I'm just using spatial location as an example of a new class of knowledge to learn, but really you could apply this to any new dimension or any class of information, really. So imagine learning that a series of shapes are associated with different spatial locations. You can tell right away that most of the shapes are either red or blue because we have prior category knowledge. At the same time, You've acquired noisy estimates of where each object is located, just like color in the previous slide, basically. We can characterize these as distributions of where you'd most likely place each object. But now combining these two sources of information gives rise to something new. I'm going to call these location schemas. This is just the knowledge that red items are mostly clustered in one area and green in the other. So this means your prior knowledge of color can be used as an aid in remembering the locations of specific objects by using this new schema. And so unlike in past work, we have these three sources of information to pull from, and we can ask new questions about how they interact with each other and what happens when we experience events that match or diverge with this new schematic knowledge. So this is the framework that I'm going to be using in both parts of my talk today. So the first thing I'm going to do in part one is kind of focus on this upper part of the triangle here and describe a behavioral experiment that asks what the relationship is between new aggregated knowledge and its constituent episodes. And then in part two of the talk, I'm going to focus down here on this lower part of the triangle and talk about how the organization of prior knowledge can distort episodic memories when they're both contributing to new learning. Okay, so part one. So we developed this experiment to try to explain a large body of behavioral work suggesting that schemas increasingly influence memory retrieval over time. Basically, over time, people are more likely to remember schema-consistent information over inconsistent or random information. It's a really well-studied effect. A predominant theory for this is that the schemas themselves develop slowly over time. So you can see this in this increasing blue bar here on the left. And a really strong form of this theory is that there's a trade-off between episodes and schemas. So in order to even form a schema, you'd have to forget the unique elements of different episodes, and whatever is common or left over kind of is averaged into a schema, basically. So you can see the sort of trade-off, the decay of episodic memories at the same time you see a development of a schema. However, this explanation cannot account for a lot of behavioral work showing that people can learn schemas really quickly within one study session. So we thought there was an alternative explanation, which is that schemas can develop quickly, but they're also more durable than episodic memories. And as episodic memories fade away or decay, people can increasingly rely on a schema instead, the schema that's kind of been there all along. And this is where that reconstruction framework comes in. So if you think of these two forms of memory as separable and able to be integrated, the prediction would be that the form of memory that's most likely to be expressed is going to be the one that's strongest. And if their strength changes over time, that would sort of predict what level of detail people are using, right? More episodic or more schematic. So that's what we aim to do here. We developed separate measures of episodic and schematic memory and tracked their use and interaction over time. So in this study, we had two groups. Both groups had an identical encoding phase and then immediate retrieval test. Then one group came back a week later for a delayed test, and the other group returned after 24 hours. During encoding, participants viewed images of objects one at a time, along with a ring and a red bar on the ring representing that image's location. And on each trial, participants had to drag the image sort of in the center of the ring there, drag it onto the red bar, and memorize its location for a later test. The retrieval procedure was very similar, except there was no red bar. Participants saw each image that they had seen in encoding and were asked to drag it to its studied location. We also mixed in new objects they hadn't seen before and asked them to just make their best guess about where that item would likely be located on the ring. So importantly, you can think of the ring as that XY plane I talked about before. So participants encoded two categories of images, animals and objects. And the locations were determined by randomly picking a point on the ring, and then also taking the opposite point of the ring and randomly sampling locations from two distributions that were centered around those points. So basically, by combining specific image location associations with the category membership of each image, participants could learn that, okay, animals mostly went on this side of the ring, objects mostly over here. Basically develop two new location schemas. So these are examples of the distribution of item locations for two subjects. So the very first thing we wanted to do was confirm that these new location schemas worked, so that they increasingly influenced retrieval, just like in those past studies. So to do that, we created two measures. Our independent measure is schema consistency. So on this ring, the dots indicate example encoded locations, one for an animal and one for an object. Schema consistency is the angular distance between each item's encoded location and its category center, basically like the location where there are the most items of that category. So in this example, the object is in a more schema consistent location, it's closer to its category center, and the animal is in a more schema inconsistent location, it's almost on the other side of the ring. The main dependent variable we looked at is precision or error. So now, just forgetting about the category centers for a moment, all we do is find the angular distance between an object's encoded location and its retrieved location. So in these two examples, we see more precise memory for the object, right? That angular distance is smaller, and we see less precise memory for the animal. Okay. So first, we're going to test if schemas actually influence retrieval and if they do so more over time. So we're going to take these two measures. We're going to look at both groups' performance immediately after learning, that's going to be in green, and then after a delay in blue. And on the x-axis, we have that schema consistency. Greater values now mean less consistent. And then on the y-axis, we have that error measure, where greater y values mean less precise or worse memory. So we're going to look at the 24-hour group first. Each dot here is a trial. This is basically a mixed effects model that includes all trials for all subjects. What we can see is at both time points, both immediately and after 24 hours, there's a positive relationship between schema consistency and error. So that means for the items that are most schema consistent, those ones are the most precise. That's like the lower left corner of the square here. And for the items that were least consistent, that they were sort of furthest away from the rest of their category members, those items had more error. You can also see just no difference by delay right now. So that just means that performance remains stable over this 24-hour period. Now we can look at 1 week. And you can see that at both time points, there's that same positive relationship between schema consistency and error. But importantly, the effect is stronger after a week. So there's a basically higher slope here, which means that the effect of the schemas was, they basically were more influential at retrieval. So an item that was less schema or more schema consistent had an even more precise error, basically relative to the items that were less consistent. So what this tells us is that after a week, episodic retrieval was more modulated by these new spatial schemas. And bringing this back to the reconstruction framework, it looks like people may be drawing more on the spatial schemas when they retrieve episodes that they're more uncertain about, where they're sort of less precise about in general. So after a week has passed. So now that we've confirmed that the schemas are doing their job and they're becoming more influential over time, we wanted to compare that to memory for the schemas themselves. So this is the critical analysis that we could use to adjudicate between the two hypotheses I talked about in the beginning. So to do this, we looked at participants' placement of the new items that were presented during the delayed test. So for these participants, we're just told to guess a location based on anything they had learned in the study. So here, these squares indicate guesses for an animal and an object. And for each one, we computed the angular distance between each guess and its category center. So in this example here, we have better generalization of an object schema, basically because the object that was guessed for this example is closer to the center of its category, and then worse generalization for an animal. Okay, so we can look at the average generalization across all animals and objects for each subject. Now on the y-axis, higher values mean worse generalization, basically. People placed items farther away from their category center. And what we see is that for both groups, people are definitely using the schemas to place these items. So the location of the items is closer to the category centers relative to what you'd expect from chance or random guessing. But really interestingly, we actually found worse generalization over time. So the participants' sort of use of the schema in placing these new objects was fuzzier for the 1 week group over the 24-hour group. So what we're taking this to mean is that even though in the sort of prior slide, I showed you that episodic retrieval is more influenced by the schemas over time, memory for the spatial schemas themselves became less precise over time, right? Contrary to what we originally predicted. So if we revisit those two hypotheses from the beginning, basically what I can tell you is that our data didn't fit either of them. Instead, what we found is that both new episodes and new schemas decayed over time, just at different rates. So this suggests, oh, and before I go on a little bit more about this, a caveat, of course, is that schematic memories will, of course, decay over time unless they're reinforced and strengthened by new experiences. So in this situation, right, this experimental setting, we sort of are generating a schema and then sort of letting it sit, which is probably less likely to happen in the real world. So just one caveat. But the fact remains that we see a decay in both of these forms of memory over time, but at a different rate. And as a result of that different rate of decay, after a week, these schemas exerted a stronger influence on retrieval. So overall, what we're taking away from this is that new schemas are formed quickly, but their use depends on their comparative strength relative to their constituent episodes. If the episodes are strong, the schema is less necessary, right? It's less likely to be used. Whereas after enough time has passed where those episodes have become weaker, the schema is more likely to be used. Okay, so that's sort of my focus on the relationship between episodic memories and new aggregated knowledge, right? So we're going to move on to part 2 of the talk now. Now we're going to focus a little bit more on the relationship between episodic memories and prior knowledge in the context of new learning. So going back to my example from before, in this part of the talk, I wanted to focus on a sort of unique, a new question that we can ask by looking at the, the sort of 3 sources of information that I talked about before, right? Like what new questions emerge from that integration that we can think about now. And what I ended up settling on for a lot of my postdoc is this question of how this integration process might shape memory for exception items. So what about items that are learned at the same time as new schemas, but don't necessarily fit with them? So you can see these 2 little exception items over here on the left. So to look at this, I'm going to leverage gradation in prior knowledge. And I'm going to ask this question, how is memory affected by an item's similarity to newly learned schemas? So in the case of this sort of orange square that looks like it's very likely to be a member of the schema, how is memory for that item different than one for this sort of blue, this blue shape that doesn't look as likely to belong to either schema? Okay. So I decided to use category typicality as a way to characterize this graded structure. Category typicality, just in brief, is the idea that certain animals, for example, are better or worse examples of a mammal. So mammals with 4 legs and fur are more typical, while animals like armadillos or kangaroos share less features with other mammals, so they're considered less typical. And typicality is one of many organizing principles of categories, but we went with it because it's a very robust predictor of a lot of different behaviors. Typical category members are more quickly recognized, they're more likely to be classified correctly, they're less prone to disruption by semantic dementia, a lot of findings like this. So what this suggests is that typical category members have stronger associations with their category, and that's what we're going to leverage in these next experiments. All of the experiments I'm going to show you were conducted on Amazon Mechanical Turk. They had the same general design. There was a learning phase and then a retrieval phase after a 5-minute break. During learning, participants viewed a grid like this, and in each trial, they saw an image of an animal or an object and a red dot on the grid showing the image's location. And just like in part 1, participants were instructed to drag the image onto the red dot and memorize the location for a later test. And they did this 3 times for each image. Then during retrieval, participants viewed every image one at a time, and they had to drag it to its encoded location. So similar to part one, we organized the location of images so that they corresponded to prior knowledge about animals and objects. So to do this, we had a separate cohort of participants complete relatedness judgments, an odd man out task basically. And we projected the resulting similarity matrix into 2 dimensions. So this is the output of that task for the animal category. You can see that the images divide pretty neatly into 3 animal categories. So mammals in blue here, kind of assorted sea creatures in red, and then birds in green. And so we use this conceptual space as the basis for the spatial locations in the memory experiment. So for most of these items, the locations you see here are the locations participants encoded. However, we manipulated a subset of the locations so that they became exception items, so they conflicted with this spatial schemas. I'll use the bird group as an example of how we did that. So the black dot here is the cluster center. We determined that using those relatedness judgments with k-means clustering. And those results also allow us to, they basically also pulled out a continuous measure of typicality for us. So you can see that the closest member to the center is a very typical bird, a category, cardinal, and a toucan, or very atypical category member, is the one that's farthest away from the center. So what we did was for each category, we took the 20% most typical and 20% most atypical category members, and we moved them to a random location on screen. So these images could be near other category members or off on their own. And that means that about 60% of the images in the experiment were clustered near their same category. They were in the location schema. And then the other 40% are our typical and atypical category members. This is just an example of a screen for one participant. It's actually only one side of their display. On the other side, we did the same thing with a set of objects. This was just to increase power. And then as a reminder here, the words represent the picture that participants saw like one at a time during encoding. And then one final thing we considered was whether the clumpiness of this display might give us problems, where you might see better memory for items in denser parts of the screen, regardless of category clustering. So to rule this out, we ran a control group for each experiment. And here we kept the same spatial locations, but we shuffled which image was associated with each location. So whenever we're comparing behavior by consistency or typicality, we measure behavior from the same locations in the control group. Okay. So the first thing we want to do was, again, make sure that people actually learned these spatial schemas and used them. So we're going to do a very similar approach as we have in part one. We're going to get a measure of precision for each memory. So again, using the birds as an example, if we have the gray words here represent encoded locations, and then the bolded words represent retrieved locations, we can get a measure of precision, just the distance, the Euclidean distance between an image's encoded and retrieved location. We looked at this separately for schema consistent and inconsistent images. And the prediction, very similar to part one, would be that there'd be more error for schema inconsistent locations. Okay, so I'm going to plot average error on the y-axis. Again, greater values mean less precise or worse memory. And the first thing we can see in the experimental group is that on average, participants had more precise memory for images near the cluster center, so for those schema consistent ones. And in the control group, we don't see a difference in error, again, despite measuring error for the exact same locations that we looked at in the experimental group. So this suggests that participants in the experimental group were able to learn and use the new spatial schemas. And as a result, the schema consistent locations were more precisely remembered because participants could draw on both memory for the specific episode or the specific image's location and more general knowledge about where that category is likely to be located. Oh, that's what I just said. Okay. Okay, so we ran a second experiment as a conceptual replication. We use a slightly different spatial layout that that better accounted for the clumpiness of those locations. I can talk about that more in detail if anyone's interested. But I'm going to focus on the other big change we made, which was adding a confidence measure after each retrieval trial. So participants had to rate how confident they were about their location memory or say that they forgot the image completely. You can see the 4 options up top here. And I just want to point out, this kind of mirrors our delay manipulation from part 1, right? We saw that memory for older memories were less precise overall, and their retrieval was more influenced by the schemas as well. So we can get at the same thing with confidence, where you'd expect less confident episodic memories would result in more of an influence on the spatial schemas. So I'm going to plot error by schema consistency separately for the 4 levels of confidence. Each dot is a subject again. And first thing you can take away, just the sort of general positive slope, which means that there was less error for very confident memories and more error for memories which people said they guessed or forgot the item, right? Which makes sense. It means that confidence is capturing the strength of these memories. Second, if you collapse across confidence, there's a main effect of schema consistency, which means we replicated our first experiment. Just in general, no matter the strength of the memories, memory for schema consistent locations is better than schema inconsistent ones. But what's important here is that we also found an interaction. So the red bars here are showing effect sizes at each level of confidence. And what you can see is the consistency effect is weakest for the locations where people were most confident on. So when people had a strong episodic memory for a location, there was less of a need to rely on the schema. And so there wasn't as much of a difference in accuracy as a function of schema consistency. Whereas on the other side of this graph, for items where people guessed or even forgot the item to begin with, they were relying almost exclusively on the schematic memory, which gives rise to a bigger difference in error as a function of it. So this is another nice demonstration of this reconstruction theory, where weaker memories were more affected by the newly learned schemas, newly learned spatial schemas. So now, having demonstrated that people are using and relying on these schemas, we wanted to ask our critical question, which is what's going on with these exception items? And particularly, do we see systematic differences in error, not just sort of less precision in general? So for this, we developed a new measure. We're calling it a bias measure. You can see it in blue here. Essentially, what we did is we measured the proportion of error that was towards or away from each item's category center. So it's kind of represented by this solid blue line for each of these items. And what's important is in this example, you can see that the toucan and cardinal had the same amount of error or precision, that's in red, but most of the error for cardinal is biased in the direction of its location schema. That's what the solid blue line is showing. And that's what we predicted. We predicted that typical category members would be more biased towards their location schema because of their stronger connections and associations with their category. So I'm going to plot that average bias for each participant now. Positive values mean on average, images were retrieved closer to their cluster center. And first, I'm going to show you the control group. You can see there's just kind of a baseline amount of bias that occurs just because of the spatial layout, but there's no difference in typicality. In the experimental group, though, we find that retrieval of typical category members is more biased towards those location schemas relative to atypical category members. So this suggests that these location memories are systematically biased. So when images are schema consistent or when they're exception items, the retrieval of typical category members is more biased, most likely on account of their stronger association with that prior knowledge going into the initial formation of those location schemas. So kind of just to hammer that in, this difference wouldn't exist if there wasn't a gradation in category membership in the first place, right? In the organization of prior knowledge that people used when forming these new schemas. So before I move on to the final experiment, I want to summarize what I've just shown to you. So if we think about error and precision, what we found is that image locations that were consistent with new schemas are more precisely retrieved than inconsistent ones, very similar to part 1. We found that less confident memories were more influenced by the schemas, suggesting they're used more for weaker episodes, again, similar to part one. And then if we think about this new bias analysis, for images that are exceptions to a new spatial schema, the retrieval of typical category members was more biased relative to atypical ones. So in the final part of my talk today, I want to talk a little bit about potential neural bases for these biases that emerge from prior knowledge. And to set up this next experiment, I'm going to visualize that bias effect for you. So we found that location memory for exception items was well explained by the integration of memory for each location and the influence of its category-based location schema. So this resulted in a bias in memory that was stronger for typical category members over atypical ones. Nicely explained by memory reconstruction theories, but these are largely cognitive theories. And I found that there was a striking parallel here with more neurobiological memory consolidation theories that propose that multiple traces of the same memory come to exist in the brain. I talked about this a little bit in the beginning, but the idea is that traces in the hippocampus reflect more episodic and event-specific components of a memory, while traces in cortex support more aggregated or schematic forms of the same memory. And this led me to wonder if these location memories are supported by mixtures of these memory systems. So specifically, is there a cortical region like anterior temporal lobe that might be responsible for the extent of bias by these location schemas? And then conversely, is there a region like the hippocampus, for example, that would support the magnitude of error, right? Which, again, could be in any direction and is more representative of the fidelity or the precision of a single event without considering its schematic influence. So we tested the blue half of that model in a TMS experiment. We used TMS to disrupt the anterior temporal lobe, the left anterior temporal lobe. And we chose anterior temporal lobe because the aggregated information in this experiment was mostly taxonomic, right? Category knowledge, which we know anterior temporal lobe supports. And our prediction is that there would be less bias after TMS to anterior temporal lobe, but no difference in error. That would suggest that performance on these location memories is supported by two sort of separable and independent memory systems, basically. So we did a very similar experiment to what I explained. People came in for a learning phase and then a 10-minute break. At the very end of that break, we delivered TMS to either anterior temporal lobe or vertex as a control region, and then participants did retrieval. This was a fully within subject design. Participants came back a week or more later and did the entire experiment again with a different set of images and TMS to the other region. So we're going to look at the same two error and bias measures now as a function of TMS. So first, we're going to look at average bias. Bias for typical category members, again, was above 0 at the group level. So they were, again, retrieved closer to their location schemas than encoded. And we saw no impact of TMS. However, for atypical category members, TMS lessened the extent of bias. So disrupting anterior temporal lobe resulted in less bias in memory for atypical category members. Next thing I'm going to do is show you error. And as a reminder, error is directionless, right? It's really thought of as a measure of fidelity. And what we see is in both typical and atypical category members, we don't see an impact of TMS. So disruption of anterior temporal lobe doesn't change the precision, or like the overall accuracy of these memories. The only thing it changed was the direction of that error. It basically, for atypical category members, made the same sort of extent of error shifted away from the location schemas, basically. And, again, I just want to point, like, you can contrast this to the behavioral data that I showed you, where sort of error and bias were always tracking each other in a healthy brain, at least. Now they've become uncoupled. So I think this is really cool. It suggests that error and bias might be supported by distinct memory systems, and interrupting one that supports the schematic or kind of prior knowledge influence doesn't influence the other that's responsible for event-specific fidelity. Okay, so with that, I'm going to summarize the talk for you today. The first thing I showed you is that new knowledge can quickly form by integrating episodic memories with prior knowledge. And then the use of new knowledge during episodic retrieval depends on the relative strength of that knowledge and the episodes. Then in part two, I talked about the relationship between prior knowledge and episodic memories. I showed you that when prior knowledge is useful for learning something new, it can bias the resulting episodes as a result. And we have some evidence that this bias can rely on anterior temporal lobe function, and it might emerge as one of multiple neurally separable memory systems. I'm actually really excited about that last point. That is the topic of the K99 that I was awarded, basically to see if these memory systems are sort of actually independent, or if there are cases where we can see that they compete or coordinate depending on sort of the phase of memory that we're talking about, encoding or consolidation or retrieval. So I'm really excited to be able to give you guys more about that sometime soon. And then you can just see that there are a bunch of arrows missing from this diagram, right? So I think this entire framework raises interesting questions about how we update our prior knowledge and how it may differ if we're drawing on aggregated or episodic memories, forms of memory to update it. And that's a lot of future work I'm interested in exploring too. So yeah, in general, I hope you leave this talk convinced that there are multiple forms of memory that are constantly interacting and shaping each other. The structure of our prior knowledge can shape memories for new events, and integrating the two can give rise to new knowledge that can in turn preserve and further shape memory for specific events. And with that, I'd like to thank my current and past advisor, the co-authors for the studies I presented today, my funding sources, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Alexa. What a wonderful talk. I have a lot of questions. I'm happy to start off, but are there any questions from the audience first? If you'd like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. You can post a question in the chat. I can read it. If there's anybody want to take the first one, or should I go? Okay, I'll go. So I want to, I guess, actually start by explicitly asking you to connect this to language. So, I know we can talk about the differences between semantics and linguistic encoding. The particular stimuli you used here, right, happen to be very easily linguistically encoded, right? The categories you put them in, really easily nameable, all of that. So does language just give us like really easy, quick schemas, and that's kind of how you think about its role in semantic knowledge? Or maybe language is just really good at forming categories, and so the kind of semantic knowledge that we want to use, or the kind of schematic knowledge that we want to use, just takes advantage of that? Or yeah, do you have more thoughts that I'm missing here?
Well, first of all, that's a great question. Super interesting. I will say the relationship that I think about the most is, it's kind of the idea that there probably isn't a one-to-one mapping between a verbal label, even tiger, right, and like the concept of a tiger, right? And so if you think about what a tiger is as also a kind of distribution of information that maybe we could quantify, maybe not, what the use of the label in combination with that concept, how it can actually shape the concept itself, if that makes sense. So is a label that has more or less